Hello everyone and welcome to PCM's Webinar Friday. We are thrilled to have you with us today for our PCM-G webinar, How to Maximize Funding Using E-Rate and Grants. Joining us today is Bob Richter, Jerry Martin, and Michael Paddock. We're going to get right into our main presentation in just a few minutes, but first I have a few housekeeping items. Please enter your questions in the question box on the right-hand side and I'll relay those to our speakers at the end of the presentation. We do send out a survey at the end of the webinar. Please fill it out and let us know how we did as well as topics you'd like to see covered on future webinars. You should see that survey in your inbox later today. Speaking of future webinars, please be sure to check out our weekly webinar schedule on our website at www.pcm.com/webinars/archive. We are recording this webinar. It will be available for playback in a few days. Recordings are posted to our webinars page along with our upcoming webinar schedule. There you can also find previous webinar recordings. Now I'd like to introduce to you today's presenters, kicking it off with Bob Richter, the president of E-Rate Provider Services. Mr. Richter has a broad and deep experience with the E-Rate program from both the applicant and service provider perspectives. Mr. Richter also served as founding director for the ESPA, the E-Rate Service Providers Association. Our second presenter will be Jerry Martin, solution architect for PCM-G. Mr. Martin has 30 plus years of experience in the IT field and currently leads PCM-G's wireless practice. And finally, we have Michael Paddock, the founder and CEO of Grants Office. Mr. Paddock works with public sector leaders to help develop funds and project in healthcare, public safety, transportation, public health, workforce development, and education. And with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Bob Richter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just get this all functional.
It's looking good, Bob.
Great. So I've got a couple pieces on the agenda today. I'm going to give a brief overview of the program, talk about who does what, and the various forms and deadlines. I'm going to do a little piece on eligible services, what's eligible, what's not, and different options that applicants have to purchase products. And then I'm going to talk about service provider conduct, what service providers can do and cannot do in the program. So the purpose of the program is to connect schools and libraries to the internet. So there are Category 1 services which provide internet bandwidth and inter-building connectivity. And there's Category 2 services which provide in-building wired and wireless data infrastructure. This was all started by the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1996. The program is owned by the FCC, which sets all the policies, and administered by USAC, the Universal Service Administration Company. They enforce the policy and they set the procedures, which are reviewed by the FCC for essentially how to get the business of the program done. There are 4 divisions of the program. There's the low income division, high cost division, rural health division, and schools and libraries division, which is the individual component that owns the program. Schools and Libraries Division, or SLD, is one of the acronyms that you'll hear pretty often, as well as USAC, the Universal Service Administration Company. The program is funded at $3.9 billion annually currently, plus rollover from previous years. It's funded by a surcharge on your telephone bill, and it's a discount program, not a grant. The program was originally funded at $2.25 billion and was increased to $3.9 a few years ago with the E-Rate modernization order. The general process timeline for how to get money in the program, I've got it broken down into 3 basic areas. Applicant pre-application tasks, those things that the applicant needs to do before filing paperwork. The center column represents the paperwork column, the Form 470, the Form 471, and the Form 486. And then to the right is the service delivery piece, which I'll just touch upon lightly today. So the pre-application phase is the technology planning phase. In this piece, the applicant is tasked with securing their resources, integrating the services that they're requesting into their curriculum, deciding on procurement strategy, etc. So under the umbrella of securing resources, this includes making certain that they have their discounted percentage. Under the program, the applicant in almost all circumstances has to pay at least 10% and frequently more. So the applicant needs to make sure that they have that 10% set aside in their budget and available for review. They need to make sure that they have computers and other devices at the end of any data cables that they're requesting. You can't have 1,000 data drops and no workstations. They need to make sure that they have HVAC in their wiring closets and proper electricity and all of those things. They need to make sure that teachers are trained to use the technology in their lesson plans. There should be some assessment strategy. And finally, they need to decide how they're going to purchase the products. Are they going to do an invitation to bid, or a request for proposal, or a request for information, or simply do a mini bid or use a state contract? So all of those things, it's essentially the technology planning phase. The procurement phase is the FCC Form 470. The procurement phase starts when an applicant files a Form 470. The Form 470 is filed online. It's publicly available. Anybody can see it or review it. And it contains, or should contain, enough information so the service providers can respond to their procurement. There are a couple rules that applicants need to follow. First, the procurement needs to be open for at least 28 days. It can be longer, but cannot be shorter. Price needs to be the most highly weighted factor. Price does not need to be 50% of the evaluation or higher. Price can be 20%, 25%, wherever the applicant sets that percentage. But if an applicant sets overall price at 25%, then no other single criterion can be 25% or more. And all the services that the applicant is looking for need to be listed on the Form 470 with category. Essentially, if an applicant lists an internal connections request, then it has to use that Form 470 to purchase internal connections equipment. For example, if an applicant does not request basic maintenance services, then the applicant cannot get basic maintenance services. And last but not least, the applicant needs to conduct a fair and open competition. This means that all service providers need to have access to the same information. Nobody can have a favored status. In addition, although applicants are allowed to list specific equipment, they want a widget 5000, they have to accept responses from other manufacturers. They have to accept other solutions and evaluate them fairly, as well as any preferred solution that they have. They're really not supposed to weight the solution one way or the other. If they list a piece of Cisco gear, they have to evaluate Juniper and vice versa. After the 28 days goes by and the procurement is closed and the applicant evaluates all the bids that have come in, then they award their contract, and then they file the FCC Form 471, which is the actual application. So the Form 470 is procurement. It says we are the Hartford Public Schools. We're looking for one router in each of our schools. We have 35 schools. Here are their addresses. We want some services to go along with there. The Form 471, which is filed after a service provider selected and a contract assigned, says, hi, we are the Hartford Public Schools. We would like to buy a router and some services for each one of our 35 schools from PCM-G. Here's PCM-G's information. Here's our information. Here's an exact bill of materials on what we're looking for. Here's our discount. please review this and fund this. So procurement form is Form 470. The application form is the Form 471. Again, it's done after contract once you've decided on specific goods and services. Once that gets filed and is filed during the filing window, then there's a lengthy and thorough review process which takes place between the Form 471 and the Form 486, where the SLD reviews the application. It's thorough and it's a lengthy process. They look at each school, make sure it's as eligible as the applicant is claiming, make sure that the services are eligible, make sure they're being delivered into eligible locations, make sure they're being used for eligible purposes. If they have any questions, and they usually do have some questions, they'll send an email to the applicant. Applicant gets 7 days to respond. Usually get an extension of 7 days if the applicant needs it. And at that point, if the questions are product related, the applicant can feel free to talk to the service provider and get the answers to those questions, because usually the technical expertise lies with the service provider. After the review process is concluded, the schools and libraries issue something called a Funding Commitment Decision Letter, or FCDL. The FCDL has one of three statuses: either funded, denied, or mostly funded. Mostly funded is reserved for those times where the schools and libraries finds a single product that they don't think is eligible. They'll decrement the request and fund the rest. And then after all that's done, then the applicant files a Form 486, which does two critical things. It tells the SLD that that the applicant wants to continue with the procurement, with the project, and authorizes the feds to pay the bills that the service provider will then begin to send in. So this is a very busy slide, but it lists all of the deadlines for funding year 2018. Now, what you will see in the middle of the slide are three things in red with an asterisk, and those things are dates that we don't know yet. Of course, they're the three most important dates, which are: when does the filing window open, and when does the filing window close? The close of the filing window is really the most important date. We don't know when it's going to open yet. The FCC has not announced that. We anticipate, and by anticipate I mean guess, that it's going to open around the beginning of February. Everyone's still doing their pre-work, and there's some issues with Epic, etc., which is the E-Rate Productivity Center, which is the dashboard. So we anticipate that the filing window will open around the beginning of February and will close sometime in May. But again, this is just a guess. It could open sometime in January or even later. We don't know at this point. So let's talk about what's eligible. So eligible services under internal connections, because we're focusing on category 2 today. Eligible services include wired and wireless data components, network electronics, hubs, routers, switches, wireless access points, wireless controllers, data cabling, racks, patch panels, raceway, all those things, UPSs for eligible equipment, basic firewalls, caching, services. So the services are installation, design and engineering, configuration, testing. Essentially, those things that are necessary to take a piece of equipment in a box and bring it up into operational status. The note at the bottom, form factor is not relevant, means there are a lot of different ways to get, for example, a wireless controller. You can buy a hardware piece of equipment, you can buy a piece of software and put it on a server, or you can get a cloud-based wireless controller. All of those things are equally eligible. So the form factor, virtual, cloud-based, or hardware, is not relevant to the eligibility of a particular product. What is not eligible? First, end-user equipment, phones, computers, printers, pretty much anything a teacher in a classroom could touch, generally not eligible. Voice equipment, PBXs, voice gateways, not eligible. Video equipment, MCUs, codecs, not eligible. This, by the way, is a change from the E-Rate modernization order. Voice equipment and video equipment used to be eligible a couple years ago, no longer. And then servers are not eligible unless they're performing an eligible function, as in a virtual cache or wireless controller on a server. Then the server might be eligible. One slide on firewalls. Firewalls are eligible as basic firewalls only, so essentially stateful inspection. The FCC has resisted attempts to expand the eligibility into next-gen features. Intrusion prevention is not eligible. Intrusion detection, not eligible. Antivirus, content filtering, spam filtering, not eligible. Ineligible features must be cost allocated out. Cost allocation is the process that manufacturers use, by the way, essentially negotiation with the SLD to determine what's eligible and what's not. Also with E-rate modernization order, the FCC determined that managed services will be eligible as of a couple of years ago. They're a separate category of service called Managed Internal Broadband Services, or MIBS, as you'll hear it called. Again, it's a separate category of service. So if you as an applicant want an internal connection service, you want to buy a router, you can do that under internal connections. Or if you want to acquire a router as a managed service, you do that as a MIBS request. Again, there's two options. MIBS which supplies the equipment, and MIBS which does not supply the equipment. So if you have a router and you want to get service on it as a router that you have previously, you can get a MIBS overlay on top of that, or you can request a MIBS contract which includes the services, plus you have the vendor supply the equipment. And FCC rules do not prohibit multiple MIBS contracts for different equipment. You can have one vendor supply MIBS for a wireless implementation and another vendor supply MIBS on a firewall. It's all okay. Equipment management strategies. So essentially applicants now have two additional ways to purchase equipment. So the last item, separate equipment purchase and basic maintenance, that is your traditional method. If you want a router, you buy the router as an internal connections request, and you get maintenance on it as a maintenance request. So you buy a Cisco router outright, and you get maintenance on it, you get SmartNet on it as a basic maintenance offering. But if you don't have a router and you wish to get a managed router where essentially the service provider comes in, owns the equipment, and manages it, monitors it, and actually has it connected to the network operations center, that would be a MIBS request with the equipment included. Or if you have the equipment separately, you can buy the MIBS overlay for equipment that you already own. So two additional options on top of the traditional option. What service providers have to do? First of all, service providers have to maintain all documentation. There is a 10-year document retention requirement that applies to applicants and service providers after the last date that services would be delivered. So for funding year 2018, the last date that a service provider can deliver a Category 2 internal connections piece of equipment would be September 30th, 2019. So September 30th, 2029 is when the document retention requirement is over for that particular request. Service providers need to avoid procurement involvement. Service providers should not be writing RFPs, should not be evaluating RFPs, should not appear on the Form 470. Service providers should avoid technology plan involvement. 4, applicants must pay their discounted percentage. If you are a 70% discount applicant, you need to pay 30%. And service providers cannot waive that or forgive it or anything else. And if there's an issue and the applicant can't or won't pay, the service providers have to make a good faith attempt to get that money. And last but not least, strict gifting rules. Service providers cannot spend any more than $50 per year per board employee, and no single item worth over 20. So A service provider could, for example, take a teacher out for a $19 meal, or two $19 meals but not three, or three $16 meals but not four. The one exception to this, the one of the frequently asked questions I get concerns conferences. If a service provider wants to give away a $1,000 hard drive at a conference, if the conference is widely attended, meaning it's more than just a K-12 conference, then if everybody throws their cards into a bowl and the service provider happens to pick a K-12 person, that's okay. If there's a reasonable expectation that you will pick a non-K-12 person, then it's all right. But if it's strictly a K-12 conference, then that expectation does not exist, and then the gifting rules apply. They can't give away anything worth more than $20. Couple quick notes on post-funding. First of all, a service substitution is used to change products after funding. If you wanted a Cisco 5000 and the Cisco 5000 was discontinued, it's now a Cisco 5001, you would use a service substitution to change that. A spin change is used to change vendors. The applicant can only change to another vendor who responded to the original bid, and you have to go in order of final evaluation. If the number one vendor can't do the project, then it needs to go to the number two vendor or the number three vendor, etc., right down the line. And last but not least, a Form 500 is used to change contract terms. If you get an extension on your funding request, or there's a some sort of service delivery extension, or you finish the project with and it took less money than you thought it was going to, you would use a Form 500 to either give the excess money back or extend the terms or any of those things. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Martin. If I can...
Okay, give me just 1 second here.
Thank you, Jerry.
Oh, all right, can you see my window now?
Yep, looks good, Jerry.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob, and thanks everybody for joining. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Jerry Martin, and I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at PCM-G. So for the next 15 minutes or so, we'll be covering a couple of important topics for successful wireless deployment in the education sector. So we're going to talk about a little bit first about our expertise and what we've seen in the field, give you some background on who we are and what we do. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the importance of wireless site surveys and how too often sometimes we see it as an afterthought or completely missed altogether. And we really feel this is one of the most critical steps in designing a robust and reliable high-density network. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the importance of securing your network, and we'll cover some of the products available and how they support and complement one each other. So on this slide, we kind of highlight a few of the types of customers that PCM-G has designed, deployed, and managed Wi-Fi for. In the education space, we support K through 12 and higher ed, from single buildings to multi-site campuses. We've even done large outdoor venues and cruise ships and operating rooms, so it's pretty safe to say that our wireless professionals have pretty much seen and done it all. So from a professional services standpoint, we focus primarily on 4 major manufacturers, and those are Cisco, Aruba, Extreme Networks, and Cisco Meraki. And the reason is because our experience in the field tells us that these really are the leaders in the industry in terms of modern wireless technology. And we do realize that there are many other players in the market that focus on education space, but when it comes to a complete service offering, these are the ones that we really feel are the leaders. And here at PCM-G, we offer a complete range of wireless services to make your deployment successful as possible, starting with surveys and assessments. And the 3 major kinds that we do, the first one is predictive, right? So for a greenfield deployment where maybe the building isn't built yet or you're putting an addition on the building, we can take floor plans and do heat maps and kind of visualize what the environment's going to look like. If we have an idea of what the walls are made out of, what the doors are made out of, we can do some pretty good site survey analysis and kind of get some predictive numbers for quantities of APs and placement and whatnot. Another kind of survey we do is passive, right? So engineers are on site, they're checking for the wireless neighbors. Let's say you're in a urban environment where you have other folks close by with their wireless networks. So that'll give us a good picture of the wireless RF environment and let us know what we're dealing with. And the other type is active survey. So the engineers are on site, again for this one, they're associated to your APs and testing for rates and packet loss. We get very detailed information at this point, and it could also be considered a validation survey, like after the fact, right? After we're out there and designing the network. So we also provide design and configuration services, physical installation and cabling, so we can do the cable plan implementation, help you get cables laid for these deployments. We do troubleshooting and optimization, so if you already have a network in place and you need to have it looked at and maybe tweak to make it run better, or help figure out how you can grow it and make sure that it's done right, we offer those services. And these services are available to you whether or not you purchase the hardware from us. And from a E-rate perspective, PCM-G is authorized to sell all the hardware that is eligible on the E-rate program. So a question we hear a lot is, why do I need a wireless survey? And it's a pretty simple answer. The survey is going to allow us to provide you with a comprehensive blueprint for deploying your wireless network in your specific environment. So, you know, two buildings that are right next door to each other on the same campus can have completely different density requirements and RF attenuation properties. What is the building material made out of? Is it concrete? Is it drywall? Is it aligned with some kind of you know, RF? It's, you know, property that's going to affect the RF. So there's you know, a lot of things that we look at. So building layout and composition of the doors and walls. We also take into account the student and faculty density. You know, are we looking at per classroom? We're looking at common areas and auditoriums. So what those things are, what those requirements are. Talking about EMI, right, electromagnetic interference. What are the potential sources of RF interference at that location? Do we have a classroom that's right next to the break room that has, you know, 3 or 4 microwaves in there? Microwave ovens, you know, are run on the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum and can cause interference, right? Does the staff at the location have cordless phones that they walk around with? Are those 2.4 gigahertz? Are those going to affect the network? So those are things we'll look at for EMI. In urban areas, again, we want to know what our neighbors are doing and what channels they're on, and that'll help us in the channel planning phase. And another big one is rogue devices. So we've seen many instances where, you know, teachers and administrators may be bringing in their own APs and plugging them into the wired network, you know, to help improve their wireless network performance, or maybe they're enabling the hotspot feature on their cell phones for the very same reasons. So, you know, these rogue devices that are in the network can really wreak havoc on even the best planned wireless deployments because of the fact that they're interfering, they're potential interferers with RF. And then finally, planning growth, right? So what's the 5 to 7 year plan for student staff growth, new buildings, et cetera? These are all the things that we look at during a wireless survey. So what are these, so how do we do these surveys and what's involved, right? So our wireless engineers generally would come on site to do the survey work, and they'll bring a spectrum analyzer to gather the information that they need for the, especially for the RF planning type, right? So the things we're looking at to help determine is the AP type, the quantity, the placement. And, you know, in the past, it was completely acceptable to put 1 AP per classroom and call it a day. You know, but in today's school environments with larger, you know, student to teacher ratios and multiple devices per student, and that's one of the kickers, is that especially in schools that allow BYOD, they may issue a device to a student, but that student will bring their own tablet or cell phone with them. So now we're looking at quantity of devices, so that 1 AP per classroom really isn't likely going to meet the needs of the environment anymore. The other thing we look at is roaming, and this is how we verify the coverage is adequate to provide seamless roaming to all the students and staff as they move from location to location, either classroom to classroom or classroom to the library, and then out to a common area, so they can continue to be productive throughout the day. And then channel planning is very critical, obviously, because especially in today where you know, schools are supporting legacy 2.4 devices, in the RF spectrum, there's only 3 non-overlapping channels in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, so channel interference can become a real issue. So planning the channel usage is critical on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And finally, but equally important, is radio power, right? So radio power settings will be important for making sure that coverage is available wherever you need to be without the APs actually stepping all over each other. And some people think, you just get an AP and crank it up to 100% power, place it, and you're good to go, right? If it's more power, the better. Well, that actually can be counterproductive to the environment you're setting up, because if you have multiple APs that are all screaming at the top of their lungs and they're all within earshot of each other, that can actually cause performance issues more than you would expect, right? So the other thing, again, we look at material composition of the building. Important to know how signals will or will not penetrate walls and doors. We look at the site layout, how plumbing and piping may affect the impact of the location of the APs. Some older buildings have HVAC or plumbing and sprinkler systems in the ceilings, and we need to know where those things are so that we can plan around them for our APs. We don't want to put AP right next to, a big HVAC system with aluminum ductwork and have signals bounce all over the place without any control. And then other environmental factors like outdoor coverage. Are we talking about outdoor coverage for a playground or sports field area, common space and outdoor, some of the things we look at. So we really feel that a site survey is an integral part of deploying a successful wireless in really any environment. So next we're going to talk a little bit about securing your wireless network. So classifying wireless LAN traffic is really the first step in securing your network. And we kind of see three major categories in education for this space. So school-owned equipment is where access to school resources is permitted, but maybe denied, we're denying access to personal Gmail accounts. Maybe the school enforces Google Safe Search and YouTube for schools on these devices. In bring your own BYOD or bring your own device environment, those are becoming more commonplace, especially in some budget-constrained districts we've seen. Differentiating students from teachers is sometimes challenging with these devices, and giving access to the right information at the right time on the right device is really critical. And somewhat less common, we see some districts providing open guest access. And maybe the school wants to provide public internet access for like PTO meetings or school assemblies where parents want to share pictures and videos with other family members in real time when they're in that event. So again, not very common, but something that has been brought up to us. So another aspect is mobile device management, another good aspect of network security policy. So in a BYOD environment, mobile device management can be used to push specific SSIDs down to a device based on ownership or location. You have a lot more control about devices that get on your network. Policy enforcement can ensure that your devices that are connecting to your network meet a minimum set of standard requirements that follow your security posture. So for example, a BYOD iPad user, a BYOD iPad that an administrator brings in, you can set a policy that this must have an passcode enabled to unlock the device, so that if the device is left lying around accidentally, a student doesn't grab it and is able to get on. Or a laptop brought in by a student must have software firewall enabled before being allowed onto the network. And then we can check for device-specific compliance, like all Chromebooks must be managed by the school's G Suite domain, or mobile devices must not be jailbroken due to potential compromise, or all computers must have antivirus. These are all the kinds of things that you can ensure with an MDM program. So beyond MDM, there's also network admission controller, what we call NAC in the industry, right? So products like a Rubrik ClearPass and Cisco ICE will give you the most granular control over the network access in this case. So, and basically NAC takes security to the next level by enforcing policies based on device and the type of user. So what we mean by that is not only is the device owned by the school or by the person, but it also takes a look at who's actually logging in on that particular device. So is this an approved teacher connecting with his or her school-issued laptop or on a personal tablet, right? So based on the results of that query, then we can decide where he or she gets access to the network. Is this request being made during normal school days or business hours, or is this traffic being seen at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, right? Likely somebody, in your IT department would want to know that kind of information before they grant access to the network. So network access control will give you that flexibility. And another thing that's pretty important to IT and security admins is the fact that these systems are not, the network access control systems are not rip and replace devices. They're not going to cause too much consternation on the network. Rather, they integrate with the existing Active Directory or radius authentication methods that a lot of schools already have in place. So we're not adding another system for them to log in and making it so complicated and having to manage a set of credentials. It's completely transparent to the end user. And most importantly, these systems can quarantine devices when they are found to be out of compliance with your security policies. For example, if somebody brings in a laptop that does not have antivirus installed, they would be placed in a quarantine VLAN that may give them just enough internet access to be able to download antivirus software or to run a security patch or whatever is required to bring their machine back into compliance in order to be left on the network. So those are just a few of the areas that we wanted to cover with you today, and let you know that we're here to help you with your wireless needs. And if you have any questions, please remember to ask them, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And thanks for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to Mike now. Mike Paddock from Grant Funding.
Thanks very much, Jerry. And let me just show my screen here.
It's looking good, Mike.
Okay, great. Terrific. All right. So, hi everybody. I'm Michael Paddock, CEO of Grant's Office. Sorry for the slight delay in the handoff there. But I am looking forward to talking with you today about grant funding. We're going to be talking about specifically grant funding for technology. Obviously, there's a lot of federal and state funding that goes toward technology, but how exactly is it broken down, and how do you make the most of what's available? These are sort of the questions that I'm going to cover today. So first of all, let's start with a little bit of level setting in terms of where the funding comes from. So the sources of funding, there are three basic sources of grant funding. The first is federal agencies. By far, the lion's share of grant funding comes from the federal government. It's about between $500 and $600 billion a year nationally. Now, not all of that funding is going to go to education. It may be for transportation infrastructure projects, for agriculture, for rural projects, for homeland security and public safety projects. So it's a really wide range of different types of initiatives that these 26 federal grant-making agencies are focused on providing funding for. But nevertheless, by far, most of the grant funding that's available comes from the federal government. Now, sometimes those federal funds flow directly to local recipients. I think about the improving innovative approaches to literacy grant, for example, where schools that want to apply can apply directly to the Federal Department of Education, or National Science Foundation grants. Most of those National Science Foundation grants are direct grants that go directly from the federal government agency that's providing the funding to the recipients of the grants. In other cases, some of that funding may flow through the state and become essentially a state grant at that point. Whether the money started out at the state level, and certainly there are state grant programs that are funded through the state tax rolls, through state bond acts, and so on, whether the grant was initiated at the state level, or whether it's a pass-through grant like the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant, for example, that passes through the state, once the state gets their hands on the money, it essentially becomes a state grant at that point. So we have federal grants and state grants sort of mixed in together. A lot of those state funds coming from the federal government initially anyway, but becoming state grants. We also have about $50 billion a year coming through private and corporate foundations. And this is especially important for educational institutions. A lot of that, if you take out religious organizations, which are the recipient of most private contributions, take out religious organizations, and you've got most of that money going for educational purposes. So for higher education as well as for K-12 initiatives. And out of $50 billion, that's a pretty significant amount of funding that's available to support those kinds of initiatives. Some of these foundations are big. The big national foundations like the MacArthur Foundation, the Gates Foundation that you hear about, but actually most of the money that you see going toward educational initiatives actually comes from smaller, maybe regional or local foundations, family foundations that support very specific local initiatives. So what you see here is a sort of flow from You can see it in any number of different ways. Large grants from the federal government flowing to small grants from private and corporate foundations. So whereas a federal grant may be, $500,000 in size, a state grant maybe on average $100,000 in size, and a foundation grant, $10,000 to $20,000. So the size can change. Also, how prescriptive the grants are can vary depending on the funder as well. So you've got federal agencies providing very prescriptive funding. They want to focus on improving literacy. They want to focus on STEM education. They want to focus on after-school programs or workforce development in 21st century careers. Those are the types of programs that the federal government is putting out there. And all the way going to private and corporate foundations where the funding goes to really locally developed projects, which is why they're less prescriptive, and also why private and corporate foundation funding makes a great match. If there's a federal grant program or state grant program that you're applying to that has a matching requirement, the private foundation route is a good way to get those matching funds covered, especially because foundations often like to be the second or third or subsequent person or organization to fund your initiative. They want to see that somebody else has already stepped up and committed to it, and they love to have their money leveraged. So for all those reasons, they're a great source of matching funds as well. So this is kind of the landscape of grant funding that we see across the country. We're going to be talking primarily about federal grants here, but keep in mind, there are state and private foundation grants that are available. If you want to know which state and private and foundation grants may fund your project, stay tuned. We'll be talking about a program that is supported by PCM-G that will enable you to get access to grants information relevant to your specific projects, your specific location, and your specific type of school. So again, this is just sort of a look at some of the different grant programs that support educational initiatives at the federal level. Keep in mind, there are 26 federal grant-making agencies, and a lot of them support some kind of educational initiative. The takeaway from this slide, I think, is that we really don't want to think about education funding as only coming from the Department of Education. Quite the contrary. There is a lot of funding that's available that doesn't come from the Department of Education as well. So while the innovative approaches to literacy, I keep coming back to that as an example, but that program does come from the Department of Education. We've got workforce development programs coming from the Department of Labor, STEM education programs coming from the National Science Foundation, distance learning and telehealth programs, as well as community facilities programs coming for rural communities from the Department of Agriculture, and so on. So we have environmental education grants from EPA and energy education grants from the Department of Energy. So just to kind of let you know that there are lots of different sources of funding for your project. And so if you're getting the idea that it's a little overwhelming, there's a lot of different grant programs out there, that is true. But the great thing about that is that really, no matter what your project is intending to do, there's probably going to be a grant program or maybe multiple grant programs that can support your initiative. Project ideas and vision for the future are sort of the grist for the mill when it comes to grant programs. So what we rely on you for is to sort of identify where you want to go, what do you want to focus on, and what sort of objectives do you have for improving student achievement, teacher performance, community engagement, whatever the specific outcomes that you're looking for are, and then it's up to us to help you find the best grant programs that are going to be the most appropriate for your project and provide the funding that you need. So in terms of technology, you've got a couple of different approaches to funding technology. These grants are what we would call A grants. They're grants that are statutorily created for the purpose of funding technology initiatives. As you can see from this imaginary pie chart here, we've got the big Pac-Man is eating all of the other pieces, the big Pac-Man being the technology component of the project. This is going to be a technology-heavy component, a technology-heavy project. Keep in mind, though, that the personnel, contractors, and supplies, and so on, other ancillary components are still going to be included in these grants. Very rarely do we see a grant program, even a technology-oriented grant program, that is exclusively technology. And that's because grants really exist to solve particular problems, deal with particular issues, or help meet certain objectives, education, in this case, educational objectives, more so than they do just to support the technology for its own sake. So even these grants that are oriented toward technology are still going to have teacher training, are still going to have supplies and so on, as well as the technology that you need to make these projects go. But here we're saying the majority of the funding, as you can see, 75% of the funding or more is going to be used for technology. This would be an A grant. A couple of examples of these so-called A grants: the Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program, which is designed to provide access to education, training, and healthcare resources for rural Americans, and provide financial assistance to encourage and improve telemedicine and distance learning services in rural areas through the use of telecommunications, computer networks, and advanced technologies that students, teachers, medical professionals, and rural residents can use. The last time we had this grant was mid-part of 2017. Our expectation here at Grants Office is that it was July 2017, is that it'll be sometime in probably June. It was a little late this year, so we're expecting it probably sometime in May or June of 2018. There's $23 million available through that program. Each grant, the grants range between $50,000 and $500,000. Most people try to get the full $500,000, but there is a matching requirement associated with it, so you will have to commit some funds to help kind of draw down those distance learning and telemedicine program funds. That's a competitive program, fairly competitive. The more rural you are, the better. Okay, another example. Again, these are just examples. Don't get too caught up in the specifics of the examples that I'm giving here. The idea is just to let you know, hey, these grants are mostly going for technology. We have lots of other grant programs. If you don't feel like these programs are going to be a fit with what you're trying to accomplish, no problem. There are lots of other grant programs out there that can support those. So the second example of a technology-oriented grant is going to be the iTest program, which seeks to build understanding of best practices, contexts, and processes that contribute to K-12 students' motivation and participation in the STEM core domains, along with what they call STEM cognate domains like information and communications technology, computing, computer sciences, data analytics, and so on. Primarily, it's from the National Science Foundation, so you know it's going to have a fairly heavy evaluation component. What they're trying to do is they're funding projects that do STEM education, first and foremost, but they're also looking to leverage the information that's generated out of those projects to better inform the broader educational community. So they'll fund those iTest projects, not only that look like they're going to have a good impact on student performance in STEM and student interest and participation in STEM domains, but also those projects that look like they're going to be able to track and evaluate and provide feedback back to the broader educational community about how those approaches have worked. There are other grant programs that are more specific to STEM education and less focused on the research and evaluation component, but don't let those research and evaluation grants scare you off. Really, all it means is you're going to want to have a grant-funded, out of the grant, PhD researcher who's involved in the development of the project and who ultimately is going to be the one writing up the reports back to the funder that describe what's been done in the project, what's been learned, and so on. In a way, you need somebody to track the program's outcomes and provide feedback back to the funder anyway. So in this case, you can just hire a PhD evaluator who's used to doing that, and they can be funded out of the grant as well. Same thing with the advanced technological education grants. These grants focus on primarily linkages between two-year colleges and schools that have the ability to develop education for technicians in the high technology fields that drive our nation's economy. So the ATE program, another example of a technology-heavy program from the National Science Foundation. $59 million is available through that program, and the awards can be anywhere from, depending on what your category you're applying under, anywhere from $75,000 to $600,000 for project-based projects, and then there can, for the center-based projects, they can be as much as $5 million. So these are pretty big grants, again, from the National Science Foundation. Now, the key here is most of these grants are going to be used for technology. Why would we ever look anywhere else besides these technology-heavy grant programs if we're looking to fund a technology-rich project? Well, the answer is because most of the grants that fund technology and most of the grants that fund technology at much, much higher levels in terms of the overall amount of funding that's available are actually what we would call technology-friendly grants. And a technology-friendly grant, as you can see here, is a grant program that isn't going to be necessarily mostly technology. It's going to be a grant program that's focused on another type of initiative. Promise Neighborhood grants, for example, are intending to improve academic and developmental outcomes of children living in distressed communities in the United States. It reaches the educational community out into those distressed neighborhoods. Well, what does that have to do with technology? Well, if you're expanding students' access to technology, if you're extending Wi-Fi into those, free Wi-Fi into those communities, if you're doing online education, online job training, then there's a technology aspect to what you're trying to accomplish. The key with these technology-friendly grants is that some of the grants are actually, and you can see two different projects in these example pie charts that you see here, two different projects that have two completely different configurations in terms of technology. One uses just a little bit of technology, maybe a computer for the person who's managing the program, and some software for the person who's managing the program. The other one may have much more significant use of technology, not because the grant program is different. These could be applications and funded projects under the same grant program. It's just a question of how much of the overall budget for each project is made up of technology. So it's up to you as the applicant to decide if and how much technology are going to be appropriate to allow you to achieve the objectives of the grant program that you're applying to. So in the case of the Promise Neighborhood grants, I gave a couple of examples there. The H-1B training and workforce development grants have a different name each year. They're funded through the H-1B visa program, which has gotten a little more press, I think, this year than it has in years past. But essentially what the H-1B visa program is it's a program that employers who want to bring in outside foreign workers to fill jobs within the United States, they bring them in on this H-1B visa. They have to pay a fee, and that fee gets accrued into an account that is ostensibly used to train Americans to do the jobs that employers had to bring foreigners in to do. So that's all to say, high-tech, mostly high-tech jobs, 21st century jobs. These are jobs where there just aren't enough American workers to do these jobs, and so employers are having to go out and bring in foreign workers. So the bottom line here is the name, although the name changes, last year it was called America's Promise Job-Driven Grant Program. They're all funded by this H-1B program. And just as with any educational and workforce development training program, technology can be a big factor. It can be a part of the classroom. It can be part of what students are learning on, because a lot of these jobs are high-tech jobs. It can be connecting different sites in a way that enables colleges to expand their reach to a broader student community. Those H-1B grants could be used for that, or again, on the left side, Project 1, they could be used for something much more traditional, paying employers, doing internships and on-the-job training, that type of thing, or a combination of the two. But the point here is that they could be either or both. The difference being that there's $100 million in the H-1B grant program. So probably more in that one grant, technology-friendly grant program, than is in all of the other A grants that we talked about on the last slide put together. So this is a lot of funding that's available for technology projects, not necessarily in grants that say quote-unquote technology in the name of the grant. The 21st Century Community Learning Centers, a lot of schools are familiar with that. Some schools use it for a significant amount of technology, others for less. This is a pass-through grant program, so it starts out at the federal level, makes its way through the states, and the states have a lot of control over the grants. Once they reach the state level, they can control the timing of grants, matching requirements associated with the grants, as well as the priorities that those grants can be used for. So in some states, 21st century grants are going to be more technology friendly than in others. Okay, now as you're thinking about preparing to go after the grant funding that's available, let me give you a few tips just for maximizing the grant funding that's out there. And then we'll get into the support that's available to you for free and no obligation to help you move through this process without having to necessarily navigate or become an expert in the whole grants landscape. You can just become an expert in your organization and your objectives and your vision for your organization, and then we'll help fill in the gaps from a grant standpoint. So the first thing is you want to cast a wide net initially. There are a lot of grants out there. You want to make sure that you're not missing anything, even though everybody knows that you won't be able to apply to all the grants you find. You know, applying for grants can be time-consuming. It can be can require a significant amount of resources from the organization. So it's one of those things you want to be focused when you actually get ready to apply for the grants. But initially, you want to cast a wide net so you make sure you're not missing anything. Second thing is, think about collaboration as a possibility. Many funders are requiring collaboration as part of a grant in order to qualify for an award. Others just encourage it, but collaboration expands your project. It may also increase the number of funders that you're eligible for, because you bring in a community college. Now they have grants that they're eligible for that you're not eligible for, and you have grants that you're eligible for that they're not eligible for. So by collaborating, you can actually expand the potential pool of funders. Third is carefully review the guidance document. Make sure you understand all the nuances of the program you're applying to. 4, lead with the project objectives. Make sure that your project objectives are driving your project and not any specific element of the project. But you want to make sure that your project is focused on the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and you're leveraging the technology in the advancement of those objectives. That's going to make your project as competitive as possible, and then everybody's happy. So number 5, follow directions exactly. We hear from funders that about 30% of applicants don't follow the basic directions that are provided, and their proposals get rejected without review, which is really the worst thing that can happen to a grant proposal. So make sure you're following the directions. Number 6, leverage whatever support is available, whether from outside organizations that are participating with you, from other collaborators, from other past winners in your area of these grants, people with experience. I would also mention vendors and vendor programs. So PCM-G has a great grant support program. Grants Office is part of kind of the empowering that program. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of the PCM-G grant support program. We can help you identify the opportunities that are available, grant opportunities that are available, help you think through your project ideas, make them grant-oriented, help you strategize which grants are going to be the most appropriate, and even in some cases help you with your application. So a lot of potential opportunity there. Reach out to your PCM-G representative for more information on the PCM-G grant support program. And just to say, thank you very much for your time today. We're looking forward to working with you. And with that, I'll pass it back to George.
Thank you, Michael. We do have some time remaining for questions. Again, if you have any questions that you have not yet shared, please go ahead and enter them in the question box now. My first question to the panel is what percent of funding is covered under the E-rate program?
E-rate program funds are based on a discount that's individual to every district. Generally, they range from a minimum of 20% to a maximum of 90%. It's pegged to a district's participation in the National School Lunch Program, so the more poor you are, the larger discount you get.
All right, thank you. And one more question for you guys. When does the filing window open for E-rate?
As I mentioned in the presentation, at this point we do not know. I estimate it's going to open about the beginning of February, but that's just a hunch more than anything based on any evidence.
All right, gentlemen, I'll leave the floor open for any final remarks.
Yeah, just want to say we're looking forward to working with you, and we encourage you to reach out to your PCM-G representative to get started with support from any of the resources that we've talked about today.
All right, gentlemen. So with that, many thanks to our speakers, Bob Richter, Jerry Martin, and Michael Paddock. And thank you all for joining us today. Be sure to check out www.pcm.com/webinars for on-demand recordings and for our upcoming webinar schedule. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again for future webinars. Have a great day.